Chapter 1. Stranded in a Sea of Predators. The atmosphere of Atraxis 4 burned hot against the crumbling hull of the Veliuran Prism. A catastrophic crack screamed through the ship's undercarriage as it plummeted through thick, turbulent clouds. Sparks and embers spat violently into the cockpit as Alara fought with trembling hands to stabilize the controls. The damage was too severe. Systems blinked red across the console, and the AI voice comm even in catastrophe repeated warnings of imminent impact. Warning: atmospheric breach detected. All core functions offline. Brace for impact. Alara tightened her grip on the controls, her slender fingers trembling as the once bright violet skin of her knuckles paled. Her dark wings, shimmering with an iridescent sheen, twitched with stress as she fought the futile battle against gravity. She barely had time to register the ground rushing toward her before the Veliuran Prism slammed into the forest canopy below. A deafening crash echoed across the planet's surface as the ship careened through the towering trees, its once graceful structure torn apart piece by piece. When the dust finally settled, a chilling silence replaced the chaos. The ship, or what remained of it, lay in a tangled mess of broken metal and sparking wires. Inside, Alara stirred, her vision blurred and her head pounding with the aftermath of the crash. Blood trickled down her temple, staining her delicate features. Her silver flight suit, once pristine and gleaming, was now torn and scorched, exposing bruised flesh beneath. Pain lanced through her body as she unbuckled her harness and fell forward, collapsing onto the cracked floor of the cockpit. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, each one feeling like fire in her lungs. She reached for the emergency kit strapped to the wall, her movements slow and deliberate, each one draining what little energy she had left. "I have to move," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse. "I can't stay here." But moving seemed impossible. Her legs felt like lead, and her arms trembled under her own weight. Still, she forced herself to crawl toward the jagged opening where the ship's hull had been torn away. Beyond it lay the dense, foreboding jungle of Atraxis 4A world known throughout the galaxy as a death trap. It was a planet where everything that moved was a predator, and everything that didn't was likely just lying in wait. Alara didn't have time to fear what lay ahead. She knew that the wreckage of her ship would attract scavengers, both animal and otherwise. She needed to find shelter, and she needed to find it fast. Clutching a jagged piece of metal as a makeshift weapon, she dragged herself out of the ship and into the jungle. The air outside was thick and humid, clinging to her like a second skin. The forest canopy above was so dense that it blocked out much of the light, casting the world in a perpetual twilight. The ground beneath her was soft and uneven, littered with fallen leaves and the bones of unfortunate creatures that had come before her. Each step was a battle against her own failing body. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to her knees, gasping for breath. She clutched at her arm, where the venom of the Nyx spider burned like liquid fire beneath her skin. The creature had struck her during the crash, its razor-sharp fangs sinking deep into her flesh before she could react. She had managed to kill it, but not before it had delivered its lethal payload. The poison was already taking its toll. Her vision blurred, and her limbs felt weak. She knew she didn't have long before it would completely incapacitate her. Desperation gripped her as she stumbled forward, each step taking her deeper into the jungle. The sounds of the forest were deafening. The distant calls of alien predators echoed through the trees, mingling with the constant buzz of insects. Every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of panic through Alara's body. She knew she was being hunted. She barely made it 20 meters from the crash site before her body gave out. She collapsed against the trunk of a massive tree, her breaths shallow and ragged. Her violet eyes darted around the forest, searching for any sign of movement. She clutched her makeshift weapon tightly, though she knew it would do little to protect her against the horrors of Atraxis 4. Her thoughts drifted to her family back on Aloria. She pictured her parents' faces, their expressions always calm and wise, and her younger brother, whose laughter could light up even the darkest of days. Would they ever know what had happened to her? Would they ever learn that she had died alone on a hostile world, her body left to rot among the predators? Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had to focus. She had to survive. The sound of heavy footsteps snapped her out of her thoughts. Her heart raced as she scanned the trees, her fingers tightening around her weapon. A pair of glowing yellow eyes appeared in the shadows, followed by a low, guttural growl. The creature stepped into the light, revealing its massive, muscular frame. It was a Garathe predator so feared that even the galaxy's most dangerous hunters avoided Atraxis IV to escape it. The beast was nearly 3 meters tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur that bristled with every step. Its claws were as long as Alara's forearm, and its fangs gleamed in the dim light. It moved with a terrifying grace, its eyes locked onto her with predatory intent. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She raised her weapon, though she knew it would do little more than annoy the beast. The Garath snarled, its muscles coiling as it prepared to pounce. Alara braced herself, knowing that this was the end, but the attack never came. A sharp crack echoed through the jungle, and the Garath let out a deafening roar of pain. It stumbled backward, blood spurting from a wound in its side. Another crack followed, and the beast fell to the ground, twitching before finally going still. Alara's eyes widened in shock. She turned her head, searching for the source of the sound. A figure emerged from the shadows, carrying a weapon unlike anything she had ever seen. He was human-tall and broad-shouldered, with a scruffy beard and piercing brown eyes. His clothes were worn and patched, and a rifle rested in his hands, smoke still curling from the barrel. "You've got some bad luck, landing here," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "But it looks like you're still breathing. Let's keep it that way." Alara stared at him, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The human stepped closer, slinging his rifle over his shoulder as he crouched beside her. "Can you walk?" he asked, his tone softening. She shook her head weakly. "The poison. I can't." The man frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. "Nick Spider, huh? You're lucky you're still alive. But that poison's not going to wait forever. We need to get you to shelter." Before she could protest, he scooped her up in his arms, his movements surprisingly gentle for someone so rugged. Alara's head lolled against his chest as exhaustion and the effects of the venom took hold. The last thing she heard before losing consciousness was the man's voice, low and steady. "Hang on, kid. You're not dying on my watch." Chapter 2. A Human's Intervention. Alara drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind a haze of fear, pain, and confusion. The sensations around her were fragmented, a jarring movement as the human carried her, the muffled roar of distant predators, and the strange scent of sweat mixed with something metallic. She wanted to speak, to ask him who he was, why he was helping her, but her body refused to obey. The poison in her veins was winning. When her senses finally began to clear, she found herself lying on something softer than the hard forest floor she'd been crawling over earlier. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing a low ceiling of metal and canvas. The dim light of a makeshift lamp flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the room. She wasn't in the jungle anymore. The shelter was small, constructed from scavenged materials. Sheets of metal, salvaged parts, and fabric that had likely been repurposed from an old tent. A faint hum of technology buzzed in the air, rudimentary systems cobbled together to keep this fragile sanctuary running. "You're awake?" The voice startled her. Turning her head, she saw the human who had saved her sitting a few meters away, inspecting the barrel of his rifle. His brown eyes met hers, and he offered a faint, reassuring smile. "Good. Thought I might have been too late." Alara tried to sit up, but her body protested. A sharp pain shot through her arm, forcing her back down. She glanced at the source and saw a makeshift bandage wrapped around the bite. "The Nick Spider," she murmured, her voice weak. "The poison." "Still in you," the man said, setting his rifle aside and standing. "But I've slowed it down. Got an old stim injector working just long enough to keep you alive. It's not a cure, though. That venom doesn't play around." She swallowed hard. Then, "I'm still dying." "Not if I can help it," he replied, crossing the room to kneel beside her. "There's a plant that grows in the cliffs east of here. The locals call it the starleaf. Its sap can neutralize Nick Spider venom. Alara's violet eyes widened. You know this. How? He shrugged, as though it were no big deal. Been here 3 years. You pick things up when survival's the only game in town. 3 years, she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. The thought of being stranded on Atraxis 4 for even a day was harrowing enough. The idea of spending years on this nightmare planet was unimaginable. Why are you still here? The man's expression darkened, and he looked away. Long story, he said after a moment. Name's Cole, by the way. Alara, she replied, her voice faltering. Thank you for saving me. Cole shook his head. Don't thank me yet. Getting that starleaf isn't going to be easy. The cliffs are deep in Garath territory. Those things don't take kindly to trespassers. A wave of hopelessness washed over her. She could barely move, let alone embark on a dangerous trek through predator-infested jungle. And yet, the idea of Cole risking his life for her seemed equally unbearable. I'll go, she said, summoning what little strength she could muster. I'll find it. Cole raised an eyebrow, his expression equal parts amused and incredulous. Lady, you can barely sit up. You're not going anywhere. I can't let you dash. Stop, he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. You're not in any shape to argue. I've made it this far on my own. I'll get the starleaf and be back before you know it. Alara opened her mouth to protest but stopped when she saw the determination in his eyes. She realized there was no changing his mind. Why are you doing this? She asked instead. Why risk your life for someone you don't even know? Cole hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. Because if I leave you to die, I'm no better than this planet. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Alara didn't press further. She didn't need to. There was a pain in his voice, a loneliness that mirrored her own. Cole stood and began gathering supplies, slipping a blade into his boot and slinging his rifle over his shoulder. He moved with practiced efficiency, checking his equipment with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. I'll be back by nightfall, he said, heading for the shelter's exit. Don't try to move. You'll only make it worse. Alara watched him go, her chest tightening as he disappeared into the jungle. She wanted to believe he'd be fine, but the reality of Atraxis 4 made hope a fragile thing. The jungle. Cole moved swiftly through the underbrush, his boots crunching softly against the forest floor. Every step was calculated, every sound analyzed. Atraxis 4 was a predator's playground, and letting his guard down, even for a second, could be fatal. The journey to the cliffs was perilous. The jungle grew denser the farther he went, the canopy above blocking out most of the sunlight. Shadows danced around him, and the air was thick with the scent of decay and damp earth. He passed a massive carcass, half-eaten and swarming with insects. The remains of some poor creature, a reminder of what would happen if he wasn't careful. Cole gritted his teeth and pressed on. The cliffs came into view just as the sun began its slow descent, casting the jungle in a golden haze. The starleaf plants grew in clusters along the rocky outcroppings, their bright blue leaves a stark contrast to the gray stone. Cole scanned the area, his grip tightening on his rifle. The presence of the plants meant the cliffs were prime hunting ground for Garaths, and he wasn't wrong. The low growl reached him before he saw it. Turning slowly, he spotted a Garath emerging from the shadows, its yellow eyes locked onto him. It wasn't alone. 2 more followed, their massive bodies moving with predatory grace. Of course, Cole muttered under his breath, raising his rifle. The first Garath lunged, and Cole fired. The shot struck true, sending the creature sprawling. But the other 2 were undeterred, their snarls growing louder as they closed the distance. Cole backpedaled, firing again. But the creatures were relentless. One managed to knock him off balance, and he fell hard against the rocky ground. The beast pounced, its claws slashing toward him. Cole rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack, and brought his knife up in a desperate swing. The blade found its mark, slicing through the creature's thick fur and into its flesh. It roared in pain, stumbling back just enough for Cole to grab his rifle and finish it off. The final Garath hesitated, growling low as it sized him up. Cole didn't wait. He fired a clean shot, dropping the beast before it could attack. Breathing heavily, he wiped the blood from his knife and turned his attention to the starleaf. He worked quickly, cutting the plants and collecting the precious sap into a small vial. By the time he finished, the sun had nearly set, and the jungle was coming alive with the sounds of nocturnal predators. "I'd better get moving," he muttered, slinging the vial around his neck and starting the long journey back to the shelter. Return to the shelter. When Cole finally stepped through the shelter's door, he was covered in dirt and scratches, his clothes torn from the fight. Alara's eyes widened in relief as she saw him. "You're alive," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "Told you I'd be back," Cole replied, managing a tired smile. He handed her the vial of starleaf sap. "Now let's get you patched up." Alara nodded, her hands trembling as she took the vial. Cole guided her through the process, helping her apply the antidote to her wound. Almost immediately, a cooling sensation spread through her arm, dulling the pain. As she leaned back against the cot, exhaustion overtaking her, she looked at Cole with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Cole didn't respond right away. He sat beside her, his rifle resting across his lap, and stared out the small window at the dark jungle beyond. "Get some rest," he said finally. "We're not out of the woods yet." Chapter 3. Into the Heart of Darkness. The jungle surrounding the shelter was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant guttural growls. Cole sat by the door, his rifle resting across his knees. The glow of the portable lamp cast long shadows across the shelter walls, blending with the faint light of the twin moons that hung over Atraxis 4. It wasn't rest he needed, his mind wouldn't allow that, but vigilance. Predators didn't follow schedules, and here, even sleep could be a fatal mistake. Behind him, Alara stirred on the makeshift cot. The starleaf antidote had begun its work, flushing the venom from her body and restoring some of her strength. Her violet skin had regained its usual luminescence, and the shallow breaths that once worried Cole were now slow and steady. "Shouldn't you rest too?" Alara asked, her voice soft yet hoarse. She propped herself up on her elbows, wincing as the dull ache in her arm reminded her of its recent ordeal. "Rest comes after survival," Cole replied without looking back. His voice was calm, but edged with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent years on the brink. "The jungle doesn't stop moving because you're tired." Alara studied him, her sharp Elorian eyes catching the tension in his shoulders and the deep lines on his face. "You've been alone here for 3 years?" Cole nodded, his gaze fixed on the jungle beyond the doorway. 3 years since the crash. I was part of a survey team sent to map this planet. Small crew. Good people. Our ship got clipped during re-entry, and we came down hard. I was the only one who made it. He paused, his fingers brushing over the scarred metal of his rifle. "At first, I thought they'd come for me. A rescue ship. Something. But Atraxis 4 doesn't play by the rules. Communication is a death sentence here. The moment you light a signal, everything within 100 kilometers comes to find you." Alara frowned, her mind spinning at the thought of being stranded on such a hostile planet. "So you survived by hiding? By staying quiet?" "Hiding's part of it," Cole admitted. "But hiding only gets you so far. You learn to fight. You learn to kill before something kills you. And most of all, you learn that everything here is hungry, whether it's a beast or just the jungle itself." Alara shivered, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her. Her delicate wings, which once shimmered with the iridescence of her species, now drooped slightly from fatigue. She thought of her own crash, the pirates who had shot her down, and how she might have faced a slow death if not for this strange, stoic human. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why risk yourself for me? You don't even know me." Cole shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I've seen enough death for one lifetime. Didn't feel right to let it take someone else, not if I could stop it." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that lingered in the air. Alara wanted to press him further, to ask about the pain she saw etched into his face, but she stopped herself. Instead, she said, "I owe you my life." "You don't owe me anything," Cole replied, standing and slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Just focus on getting your strength back. Tomorrow, we'll figure out a way to get you off this rock. A plan for escape. By the following morning, Alera's strength had returned enough for her to sit upright and eat a ration bar from Cole's limited supplies. It tasted like compressed ash, but she didn't complain. Every bite gave her a little more energy, and that was what she needed most. Cole, meanwhile, was tinkering with a small, box-like device. Wires and circuits spilled out from the metal casing, and he worked with the precision of someone who had rebuilt this machine countless times. "What is that?" Alera asked, watching him. "A distress beacon," he said without looking up. "I scavenged parts from my own ship to build it. It's rudimentary, but it works if only for a few seconds before this jungle sniffs it out." "You've had this for 3 years?" Alera asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Cole nodded. "Didn't have much of a choice. First time I activated it, I wasn't ready. A pack of Garaths found me before I could reach a safe spot. Took down 3 of them, but I was limping for weeks. Learned my lesson. Timing is everything." "And now?" Alera pressed. "Are you ready now?" Cole hesitated, his hands pausing mid-motion. "Maybe, but if we do this, we'll have to move fast. The signal will draw everything in the area. We'll have minutes, maybe less, before the jungle turns into a feeding frenzy." Alera's wings twitched involuntarily, a sign of her nervousness. "What's the alternative?" "There isn't one," Cole said simply. "Your people aren't going to find you on their own, not here. This is the only way." Alera took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Then let's do it." The beacon's call. The beacon was set on a small rise near the shelter, its antenna extending upward like a fragile lifeline. Cole stood next to it, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the jungle for movement. Alera stayed a few meters behind him, clutching a knife he had given her, small, but sharp enough to kill if it came to that. "Once I activate this, we'll have to move fast," Cole said. "I've got a spot 2 clicks from here. It's a cave, shielded by rocks. We'll hole up there until the rescue ship arrives." Alera nodded, her pulse quickening. She wasn't ready for this, but she knew there was no choice. Cole pressed the button. The beacon's light flared to life, a pulsating blue glow that sent a signal screaming into the atmosphere. Alera could feel it, a faint hum that resonated in her bones. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the jungle came alive. The growls started first, low and guttural, echoing from every direction. Branches snapped, and trees shook as creatures began converging on the source of the signal. Shadows darted through the underbrush fast, predatory shapes that moved with terrifying precision. "Move!" Cole barked, grabbing Alera's wrist and pulling her along. They ran, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor. The noise around them grew louder, a cacophony of snarls and roars that sent adrenaline surging through Alera's veins. She could feel the predators closing in, their hot breath and sharp claws just a heartbeat away. A Garath lunged from the trees, its massive body blocking their path. Cole didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired, the shot striking the creature in the chest. It stumbled back, but another was already taking its place. "Go!" Cole shouted, shoving Alera forward. He turned to face the predators, his rifle cracking in rapid succession. Alera hesitated, torn between running and staying to help, but the sheer number of creatures forced her to move. She sprinted toward the cave, her wings fluttering as she leapt over fallen logs and ducked under low-hanging branches. Behind her, the sounds of gunfire and snarling beasts filled the air, followed by an explosion that shook the ground. Alera reached the cave, her chest heaving as she turned to look back. For a moment, she thought Cole was gone. Then he appeared, bloodied and limping, but alive. He stumbled into the cave, collapsing against the wall as Alera rushed to his side. "You're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. "Just a scratch," Cole muttered, though the gash on his leg told a different story. "We'll be fine. Just hold tight." Outside, the jungle roared with fury, but inside the cave, they were safe for now. Chapter 4. The Final Trial. The cave offered momentary respite from the chaos of the jungle. Shadows danced across the walls as faint light from the entrance filtered through, barely illuminating the space. The sound of the predators outside was muffled, but constant low growls and occasional snarls as they circled, waiting for their prey to make a mistake. Ilara crouched beside Cole, her hands trembling as she inspected the wound on his leg. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of his pants, pooling around a jagged gash that stretched from his knee to his calf. "You call this a scratch?" she asked, her voice sharp with worry. "I've had worse," Cole replied, his tone calm despite the pain etched into his face. He leaned his head back against the cool stone wall, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. "You've got to stop looking at it like I'm dying. It's just a leg." Ilara tore a strip from the hem of her flight suit and pressed it against the wound, applying as much pressure as she could. "It's more than just a leg if it keeps you from running," she muttered. Cole winced but didn't pull away. Fair point. The cave was small, barely large enough to accommodate the two of them, but its narrow entrance and rocky walls made it a defensible position. Cole had chosen well. Still, Ilara couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. The predators outside wouldn't wait forever, and if the distress signal had truly been heard, the rescue ship would take time to arrive. "How long do we have to stay here?" she asked, glancing toward the cave entrance. Cole opened his eyes, his expression thoughtful. "Depends on how far the signal reached. Could be hours. Could be days." "Days?" Ilara's wings twitched with anxiety. "We don't have days. You can barely walk, and those things dash." "They'll lose interest eventually," Cole interrupted, though his tone was more to reassure her than reflect certainty. "Predators don't waste energy on something they can't reach. Right now, they're waiting to see if we'll come out." Ilara sighed, her shoulders sagging. She leaned against the wall beside him, her gaze fixed on the faint glow of the jungle beyond. "Why did you come back for me?" she asked after a long silence. Cole turned his head slightly, studying her. "I already told you. I couldn't just leave you to die." "But why?" she pressed. "You've survived alone for 3 years. You didn't have to risk everything for a stranger." Cole's eyes softened, the weight of his years on Atraxis 4 showing in his expression. "You don't make it this far by being selfish. Survival might keep you alive, but it doesn't make you human. Helping you." He paused, searching for the right words. "Helping you reminded me what it feels like to matter." Ilara didn't know how to respond. Instead, she reached out and rested a hand on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it carried more weight than words could. The waiting game. The hours dragged on, the tension inside the cave growing with each passing moment. Ilara tended to Cole's wound as best as she could, using a sterilizing agent from his first aid kit and binding the injury with more strips of fabric. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold for now. Outside, the sounds of the jungle shifted. The growls and snarls of the predators became less frequent, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of other creatures. Ilara dared to hope that the worst had passed. "I think they're leaving," she whispered. Cole nodded, his eyes half closed. "They'll come back if they hear movement. Stay quiet." The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the cave's ceiling. Ilara's thoughts wandered as exhaustion began to take hold. She thought of her family on Aloria, the fear they must feel not knowing whether she was alive or dead. She thought of the pirates who had shot her down, wondering if they even cared that she'd survived the crash. Most of all, she thought of Cole the strange, gruff human who had risked everything to save her. His strength and resilience amazed her, but it was his quiet compassion that struck her the most. Despite everything he had endured, he still cared enough to save a stranger. "Cole," she said softly, breaking the silence. He murmured, his head tilting slightly in her direction. If we make it out of this, what will you do? Will you go back to Earth?" Cole was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "Earth stopped feeling like home a long time ago," he admitted. "I don't know. Maybe I'll just keep moving. Find somewhere quiet where I don't have to fight every day to stay alive." "You could come to Aloria," Ilara offered, surprising even herself with the suggestion. "My people. We owe you a debt. I owe you a debt. You'd be welcome there." Cole chuckled softly, though it quickly turned into a grimace of pain. An old soldier like me? Don't think I'd fit in with a bunch of diplomats and scholars. You might be surprised, Alara said, a small smile tugging at her lips. The rescue. The faint hum reached them first, so soft at first that Alara thought she'd imagined it. But then it grew louder, a rhythmic vibration that resonated through the cave walls. She shot to her feet, her wings fluttering with anticipation. "They're here," she whispered, her voice filled with equal parts relief and disbelief. Cole pushed himself upright with a groan, leaning heavily on the wall for support. "Then we'd better not keep them waiting." Alara helped him to the entrance of the cave, her eyes scanning the sky for any sign of the rescue ship. It wasn't long before she spotted it, a sleek, silver craft cutting through the jungle canopy. Its engines roared as it hovered above the treetops, a beacon of hope in a world that had offered little. A rope ladder dropped from the ship's undercarriage, swaying gently in the breeze. Two figures descended, both clad in protective gear and armed with plasma rifles. They moved quickly, their sharp eyes scanning the area for threats. "Over here," Alara called, waving her arms. The rescuers spotted them and hurried over, their expressions a mix of relief and urgency. "Are you Alara of Aloria?" one of them asked, their voice muffled by their helmet. "Yes," Alara replied. "This is Cole. He saved my life." The rescuer glanced at Cole, their gaze lingering on his injuries. "We'll get you both out of here. Stay close." The journey back to the ship was tense but uneventful. The predators seemed to have scattered, perhaps driven away by the noise of the engines. Once aboard, Alara collapsed into one of the padded seats, her body finally allowing itself to relax. Cole sat beside her, his face pale but his eyes alert. As the ship lifted off, carrying them away from the nightmare of Atraxis IV, he turned to her and said, "Looks like you're going home." Alara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Not without you." Epilogue. A new beginning. The rescue ship docked at a massive Alorian space station, orbiting a brilliant blue star. Alara's people greeted her with tears and embraces, their joy at her return palpable. When she introduced Cole, there was a moment of hesitation. His rugged appearance and gruff demeanor starkly contrasted with their refined elegance, but it didn't take long for them to accept him. In the days that followed, Cole found himself adjusting to a life he never thought he'd have. The Alorians offered him a place among them, a chance to heal and rebuild. And while he initially resisted, the quiet kindness of their people and the unwavering support of Alara gradually broke down his walls. For Alara, Cole was more than just her savior. He was a reminder of the strength and resilience that could be found even in the darkest of places. Together, they forged a bond that transcended their differences, proving that even in a galaxy filled with danger and despair, hope could still be found. Their story wasn't over, it was just beginning.